I guess we'll begin. Leave the door open so people can wander in because it's going to be awesome. It's going to be super awesome. So this is an example kind of teaching demonstration sample lecture thingy based on a course, Oceanography, which is one of the pre-honours courses that forms part of the core of the Environmental Geoscience BSc. But it's actually taken by a huge range of students from all kinds of different flavours of science. That's one of the really good things about the degrees, I guess, in Edinburgh and more widely in Scotland, is that we get quite a lot of opportunity to take courses that are kind of peripheral to the degree that we're potentially interested in. So it's totally normal for people to take a biological sciences degree. I mean, I wouldn't hold that against you. But it does also allow you to, even if you are taking that degree, to take some earth science courses as kind of add-ons to a degree to give you a more broad education. So this is part of one of the lectures from this Oceanography degree lecture series. Now, I won't be able to deliver it in the same way that I deliver normal kind of lecture content because when I give lectures and when vast majority of other lecturers give lectures, it's not just kind of the man at the front and the talking and then the listening and then the hopefully writing down and remembering. That's not really how it works, and that's not a terribly effective way of getting you guys to learn and remember stuff. So what I usually do is post a bunch of either reading or more commonly nowadays I basically make little short videos to cover some of the background science that will be covered in the lecture, which I'll expect students to kind of read or watch or stuff before the lecture. Now, you can't do that because I couldn't email you to give you some homework before this because, we've just met now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of skip over a little bit of the introductory material, then we'll get onto the kind of lecture material kind of proper. So this is just, annoyingly, the internet doesn't work on this PC because they've logged on as guest for the open day. So I've got screenshots of what the internet looks like for those that are new to the internet. So for each course, there's usually some kind of online kind of portal where we kind of store all of the information for that course in terms of, what the deadlines are, what the different pieces of coursework are, what the lecture's timetable is, and for each lecture there's usually some content. So have I got some of the next one? Oh, I haven't, yeah. So you basically go into a folder and there will be some material in that folder for you to do for that lecture. It would also maybe include the lecture content. Also, we are now recording almost all lectures, so I'm actually recording this now. So if you are furiously making notes, you don't have to. You can email me at the earth.sciences email address, which is on all of the flyers from the Earth Sciences stand next door, and I can send you a link to the recording of this. That's not so students don't have to turn up. It's a really useful revision tool to be able to go back through the lecture content at your own pace. Also, that kind of electronic portal has a link to the library where we store all of the textbooks and stuff for the course, and they are now almost all available online now. So in terms of cost savings to students, that's quite good. So it's all linked from one kind of portal, so you don't have to kind of go looking for the right text and stuff like that. It's kind of just there for you to go and do it. Okay, so example here, you can basically book on ocean circulation, and you can kind of download chapters as and when you need them. It has some kind of weird, I'm not sure how this like PDF witchcraft works, but it deletes itself off your laptop after a while. So it's like giving it back to the library, and then you just have to download it again. It's like copyright rules or something like that. And yeah, so this is a PDF of that book, which you might want to read about if you're doing the oceanography course. Yeah, so here is the kind of stuff I'd post before kind of the lecture series. I might ask students to maybe watch some background chemistry because there are so many options. Students are from quite a diverse range of backgrounds in terms of their prior knowledge. So you might say, if you've not done any chemistry, read up or watch this video on chemistry. If you've not done the previous course on marine nutrients, maybe material is available there. And I also post lecture recordings on here as well. Okay, there's more of that. Okay, so that's kind of the logistics of how the kind of learning workflow works. There's stuff available to you read beforehand, and then we have these lectures, and then you can go back to those introductory materials and the lecture recordings afterwards as well. So the intro for this lecture involves a bit of background biology of corals. So corals are an animal that's basically very closely related to jellyfish, and they have these, well, some species of coral, certainly the ones that live near the sea surface, have these symbiotic algae that live within the coral organism, and those algae can photosynthesize, taking CO2 from dissolved in the water, and they produce organic matter and oxygen, and both of those are then used by the organism, the animal part of the coral, to basically provide energy through regular oxic respiration. Yeah, so that's basically the energy flow between these symbionts. There's also, the corals can live without these symbionts. Okay, so they are an animal that can kind of filter feed. They have quite a simple stomach, mouth/anus, which they eat and don't eat through. So they can survive without these symbiotic algae. They can get energy by filter feeding, but they get less energy. And then some corals build this hard skeleton made out of calcium carbonate. So what happens with coral bleaching is when this system kind of goes a little bit wrong, and for some reason the corals eject the algae. So they basically throw out those symbiotic algae, and there are a number of reasons why a coral might do that. The mechanisms are not fully understood, but it basically, that's the thing that gives corals their colour, because those are the photosynthetic pigments that are doing the photosynthesis. So the coral is effectively thought of as naked. It's not dead. Okay, so this is a coral that has bleached. It's still alive. It's able to filter feed particles from the water column, but it's in a much more stressed state because it can't get as much energy as it could if it had these symbiotic algae living with it. Yeah, so what might happen if that situation persists for a long time is that the corals will become so stressed they may start to die or become more susceptible to disease. So this is a healthy reef over here on the left. It's bleached, still alive here for some reason. In this case, it's a particularly warm period in the ocean, and that's caused the coral to go, ooh, it's a bit hot. I don't like these algae when it's hot for some reason. And they chuck those out. And if that persists for a long time, the corals eventually die. Okay, and this is a dead coral reef. And it might look quite similar to the alive one, except you might be able to make out that there are these little kind of blue tips to the corals, and they're kind of yellowy. Those are the photosynthetic pigments. Whereas over here, actually the coral is just dead sticks of calcium carbonate covered with basically seaweed. Okay, so this is bad. Ooh, backwards. Okay. Okay, so now the introduction to the chemistry part is that carbon dioxide is a trace gas in the atmosphere. At the moment, it's just over 400 parts per million. But that actually corresponds to quite a large total amount. So we've got gigatons of carbon here. So 870 gigatons of carbon are in the atmosphere as CO2. Now, just like with almost every gas, if you have a gas and a liquid in kind of contact, some of the gas will dissolve in the liquid. Now, some gases dissolve more than others. CO2 is actually reasonably soluble in water. But the really important thing about carbon dioxide is when it dissolves in water, it doesn't just kind of enter the dissolved phase. It actually reacts with the water and forms these other forms of carbon. So it forms this HCO3-, the bicarbonate ion, and the CO3-, the carbonate ion. And the really important thing is that these two species are completely aqueous. They don't have a gaseous form, so they can't exchange with the atmosphere. Only the aqueous CO2 can exchange with the atmosphere. So if we can convert lots of the CO2 into these forms, it's basically locked away from the atmosphere. It's trapped in the ocean, and it can't exchange with the atmosphere. And this means that we can actually store huge volumes or huge masses of CO2 in the ocean, both in the surface ocean and also in the deep ocean. Okay, so you can see almost 40,000 gigatons of carbon are in the ocean, which is huge compared to the atmosphere. So looking a little bit in more detail at the chemistry of this, these are the reactions that occur when CO2 reacts with water. So it dissolves, it becomes aqueous, then it reacts with water to form carbonic acid, which is a very unstable molecule. This doesn't hang around for very long. This decomposes to the bicarbonate ion and a hydrogen ion, and then that subsequently decomposes further to the carbonate ion and a hydrogen ion. Okay? So this is the process by which CO2 is effectively being taken out into the ocean. Now, the important thing for this lecture is that when these reactions happen, they're producing hydrogen ions. So what this means is that when we add CO2 to the water, either through burning fossil fuels or just adding it directly to the ocean in some other way, that will dissolve and react and form hydrogen ions. And that is basically what is acidifying the ocean. So we're basically, by adding CO2, we're adding an acid. Also important is that these reactions are important, but the other way around. In that actually, if you have lots of hydrogen ions in the ocean, or if you have a low pH, so it's a high hydrogen ion concentration, that will force these equilibrium reactions over to the left-hand side. So actually, the pH of the ocean determines the relative proportions of CO2, bicarbonate, and carbonate ion. And that's what we see here. So if we've got a very high pH, everything is mostly carbonate ion, CO3 2-. And if it's a low pH, we've got mostly CO2. So the important thing, hopefully you remember from the slide before, is that only CO2 can interact with the atmosphere. So the more of the carbon that is in these blue and red forms, the more we can lock away in the ocean. So if we, instead of looking at, on the y-axis here, the kind of relative proportions of each of the carbon species, if we now look at the total amounts, that's this plot. This means that at high pH, most of the carbon is this carbonate ion and is locked away from the atmosphere, which means the amount that's in the ocean compared to the atmosphere can be very large. But as we go down to lower pH, most of the CO2 will be, well, most of the carbon will be a CO2. So that means that the ocean can store less carbon and more will therefore proportionally be in the atmosphere. So there's a really important feedback here, and it's a positive feedback, and that's positive in it's self-reinforcing, not that it's a good thing. It's definitely not a good thing. If we add CO2 to the atmosphere, that will acidify the ocean, and that means that the ocean can store less carbon, which will mean the atmospheric CO2 concentration will go up. So that's bad for climate, and it's also bad for the ocean because it's changed the pH. And that's what we're going to be looking at for the lecture. So we're going to look at coral reefs. So this is the actual lecture now. That bit you'd have done at home. So coral reefs, this is the Great Barrier Reef. It's a model of the bathymetry. You've got Queensland over here. You've got the Queensland Trough here, the deep ocean. And then you basically can see the coral reef is built out to this kind of ledge-shaped thing with shallow lagoons and this barrier reef along the edge. Okay? And the things that are going on that reef, there are basically two important processes. There are things that produce organic carbon, okay? So things that are photosynthesized and they're producing organic matter, and there are things that are producing this white stuff, this really fine-grained mud, which is ultimately being produced from carbonate producers, the things that grow calcium carbonate shells, so like corals like this. So we have corals that grow calcium carbonate, but they also produce organic matter because they've got this living animal on them. There are also a kind of algae, so some algae also secrete calcium carbonate skeletons as well as organic matter that make up the algae. There are other kinds of algae that look a little bit like seaweed like this. These are an organism called Halimeda. So these look like they're nice and green, but on the inside they've got these kind of white plates of calcium magnesium carbonate. Things like sea urchins, they're not really photosynthesizing. I think some might have some symbiotic algae, but most of them do not. but they produce hard calcium carbonate shells. So they're producing calcium carbonate. And we also have other organisms. We have these things called benthic foraminifera, which are basically like single-celled little organism beasties. These are particularly large kind. The pyramids are made out of this kind of little organism, ultimately, which is a side factoid, which you may or may not know. I guess you know it now. Nummulites made of pyramids. But these basically have little calcium carbonate shells, and they live on coral reefs. Even fish produce calcium carbonate. So fish, not bony, they don't have kind of calcium carbonate skeletons, but when they kind of like drink seawater, they process that in their stomachs in such a way that when they poop out stuff, I guess fish poop, it contains microcrystalline calcium and magnesium carbonates. So this is fish producing solid material out of seawater. And you also have things that just produce organic matter, so things like seagrasses and seaweeds. So what we're going to do is look about what the effects of these processes are on the chemistry of the water. Now I will put a little caveat in here, is that this first one, this is not the reaction for photosynthesis. Okay, if you're kind of revising for biology hires or A-levels, look away now. These are not kind of true chemical reactions, they are summaries of the process. So with photosynthesis, CO2 and water gets turned into organic matter and oxygen. Okay? The actual chemical equations of the Calvin cycle and stuff like that are different. Respiration takes organic matter and oxygen and produces CO2. Okay, so those are fairly straightforward. Now carbonate production is a little bit weird. So we take calcium ions and bicarbonate ions, and then we produce a solid calcium carbonate. That's the thing that makes up the skeletons of the corals, and that actually releases the CO2. Okay, so this is kind of a bit weird in that you're taking carbon out of the ocean by making this solid lump of calcium carbonate, but you actually end up adding CO2 to the water. Okay? And likewise, carbonate dissolution is the reverse of that process. Okay, so what we're going to do now is have a bit of a think about what this means in terms of the chemistry. Now, if this was a real lecture, you might all have an app on your phone which just, allows you to kind of vote and give answers kind of anonymously. We don't have that because we just met, right? So what I would do, I'd say, well, photosynthesis, it removes CO2, there's the process. What will that do to the hydrogen ion concentration? And then we'd all vote on that. So can we have hands up for goes up? Oh, audience participation. Hands up for down. Hands up for I don't want to put my hand up. Oh, you guys are so weak. Right, so if we have a look at the equations down here, so if we add so we're taking CO2 away, okay, so we're removing that. That will shift these equilibria over to the left-hand side, so we should be removing the hydrogen ions. Yeah? And if we remove the hydrogen ions, what will happen to the pH? Bear in mind, pH is the minus log base 10 of hydrogen ion concentration, which you'll remember from, yeah. Hydrogen ion concentration goes down, pH goes up. Okay? And we wouldn't like labour the point by going on the next one with the voting because it's the opposite, so up and down. Now with the carbonate production, so we're adding CO2 and removing hydrogen, adding CO2 and removing bicarbonate. So what's that going to do to the hydrogen ion concentration? Hands up for up. Hands up for down. Hands up, I don't want to put my, okay. Right. So it actually raises it. Okay, because we're adding this forces all these reactions over to this side, which we get more of these guys. So pH goes down. Which is weird. It's not that weird. The thing is that if you grow a coral reefs form, that will acidify the water. Okay? So there's that, and these guys go in the opposite direction. Okay? So what we're going to do now is have a look about how this plays out on an actual coral reef. So this is Palmyra Atoll in the Pacific. It's a kind of a constitutionally weird place. It's part of the USA, but kind of not part of the USA. Anyway, no one lives there, so it doesn't really matter. But because no one lives there, there are some of these really spectacular, pristine coral reefs there. I guess at this time here they had a population of 4, the 4 scientists that were probably making these graphs. So what we've got here is 2 measuring stations. One which is in the middle of that plateau inside the coral reef, and one which is right on the edge. And at each of these stations, they're measuring the temperature of the water and the pH of the water continuously. So we've got at the top 2 graphs here are the inner lagoon, and the bottom 2 are the fringing reef around the edge. So the first thing to point out is that the blue one is pH and the red one is temperature. And then these black lines, these are the average conditions in the ocean kind of outside the island. Okay, and the dashed line is the kind of the seasonally low, the lowest pH could get. So the first thing to note, if we just ignore the temperature ones, is that the pH on the island and on the edge of the island is lower than the water surrounding it. Okay, and that's not immediately, ridiculous, because if we flick back to here, where coral reefs produce lots of carbonate, and they should be acidifying the ocean. The other thing that's kind of striking is that if we look at the difference between the two, the inner and the outer site, so this is the inner one and this is the outer one, there's a lot more variability in the inner site than the outer site. Okay? And if you were to have a lot of time on your hands, you could count how many cycles there were, you could compare that to the number of days. It turns out that these are daily cycles in pH. pH goes up and down every day. Whereas on the outer site, they don't so much. They still have a little bit of a cycle in there. And that's because these are able to mix with the ocean, so that somewhat moderates the variability, whereas the thing that's driving the variability is on the coral reef up here. Okay? So it's not really able to mix with the ocean so well because it's isolated from it. So let's have a look at what's happening on this annual cycle. So these are some data from an experimental site, so they're not truly natural. But what we've got here is, in the blue, the irradiance, so that's how sunny it is, and time along the bottom. So in the daytime it's sunny, and in the nighttime it's not. Not groundbreaking research there. But what the measurements they've made is they've got this G-net, moles per hour per meter squared. So that's basically how much calcification is going on, how much the corals are growing in terms of how many moles of calcium carbonate they're producing. And if you look at that, you can see that both corals and algae, they kind of grow more in the daytime. But they still calcify at night time, just not as much. And that kind of makes sense. It might use some energy to grow that calcium carbonate skeleton. And when you've got more energy, when it's sunny, you're producing more energy through these photosynthetic symbiotic algae. You can do more stuff, but at night time, you can't do so much stuff because you've not got so much food. Looking at detail about what the effects of this calcification are, we can look at the pH down here. So the pH, as we expect, goes up. Well, I don't know if we expect this yet. It goes up during the day and down during the night. So in the night time, we have calcification going on. But in the daytime, we have calcification and photosynthesis. So we can see in this plot down here the dissolved, the dissolved oxygen concentration. The oxygen concentration goes up in the day and down during the night. So at this point, photosynthesis is happening. So in the daytime, photosynthesis and calcification are happening. Photosynthesis is reducing the acidity. Calcification is increasing it. But photosynthesis wins out. There's more of that. Whereas in the nighttime, pH comes down again because there's no photosynthesis, so calcification wins out and acidifies the ocean. I should just point out that the reason that it doesn't start and finish at the same place each day is because of the experimental setup. Basically, these are happening in an enclosed kind of like massive, well, basically a massive beaker rather than the open ocean. So there is some bias in the results there. So why do we care? I mean, who cares, right, if the pH goes up and down? Well, the corals care. So this parameter here, this Greek omega, is a chemical parameter. It's the saturation state. And you can see that's higher during the day, lower during the night. What is saturation state? I hear you all ask in unison, confused and bewildered. So saturation state is just whether, it's basically a measure of whether a mineral will spontaneously precipitate or dissolve. So it's made up of the concentrations of the components of the mineral, in this case calcium, ion concentration and carbonate ion, and the solubility constant. So if the concentrations of these components go up, this number will become larger. If it's greater than 1, that mineral will precipitate out. If it's less than 1, it will dissolve. So if we are lowering this number, that's going to make it harder and harder for corals to grow these skeletons. We can have a look at this effect here. So we've got basically 3 organisms, a coralline algae and 2 forms of coral, an aquaporin and a porites. And then these are basically sets of measurements made across different pH ranges, so high pH to low pH. And you can see the lower the pH is, okay, the lower the calcification rate. So these things are finding it harder to grow as the ocean acidifies. Bearing in mind that when they grow, they acidify the ocean themselves, which is kind of like a self-regulating kind of little mechanism there. But they're not only finding it harder to grow, they're also stressing the coral in other ways. So if we look at the graph down the bottom, this is the prevalence of bleaching. So the corals are bleaching more when there's a lower pH. Okay, so the corals, so if we make the ocean more acidic, then this is bad. And if we look at what's happening on a global scale, so we were looking before just at one little tiny island and these daily cycles. If we look at a global scale, we can see that as we're increasing the atmospheric CO2 concentration, we also increase the CO2 concentration in the water, that's the blue curve, and the pH is gradually declining as well. So by putting CO2 into the atmosphere through all our fossil fuel shenanigans, we're also making it harder for these corals to grow and more likely to bleach. Okay, so that's kind of one aspect of chemical oceanography and coral reefs. We're going to have a quick look at another impact of coral reefs, and that's nutrients. So things like the fertilizer you would put on a field, so nitrate and phosphate. So most coral reefs actually survive very well when those concentrations of nutrients are very, very low. Okay? Coral reefs are actually very, very well adapted to recycling nutrients so they can survive with very low concentrations. But when you have, if we just have a look at these schematic diagrams here, so if they're very, very, very low, they don't do this so well. With a tiny amount, corals do quite well. So up is corals being happy. But then when you get to high concentrations, they're not so happy. Now, the reasons for this are there are direct physiological effects on the corals of having these chemicals in the water, but there are also these indirect effects. Now, we can't do all of this because we're, time and lecture example shortened. So we're just going to have a look at these indirect effects. So the most obvious and most kind of easily observable effect is that when you put lots of nutrients in the water, like you've got lots of fertilizer going into the ocean, then things that can grow really quickly start to grow really quickly. So you get quite a lot of algal blooms, so lots of rapid production of organic matter because you've got lots of nutrients which can be used up by these algae. And that has a number of effects. So first of all, it can reduce the visibility through the water, so less light can penetrate down to the corals, so they get less energy from photosynthesis because it's being blocked out. You can also compete for space, so algae can basically overwhelm the corals through this kind of, algal mat of gooey greenness, which is horrible. But there's more going on than just smothering and cutting out the light. So quite a lot of these algae, basically seaweed, they produce toxins to stop them being eaten by fish, because if you're an algae, you don't want to be eaten by fish, because then you just become fish poop. And it turns out that those toxins are also harmful to corals. So here are some experiments where they've basically zip-tied some algae onto a coral and seen what happened. So you've got some controls here, and then different kinds of algae which have been added to different coral, so different kinds of porosities here. And you can see that as you add, so this is the coral, so the bleaching percent, when you add seaweed, the prevalence of bleaching goes up, and the quantum yield, so the photosynthetic efficiency of the corals goes down. Okay, so adding seaweed can be bad. You're cutting out light, but the seaweed is basically attacking corals with chemical warfare. Nasty stuff. They also do biological warfare, because if you have lots of seaweed, lots of algae growing, that increases the amount of organic material in the environment. Now that will ultimately decay and produce dissolved organic carbon floating around in the water column, which becomes a food source for bacteria. So you increase the amount of algae, you increase the amount of basically pathogenic bacteria, which can then attack the corals, which kill the corals and make more space, so more algae, a vicious circle of coral death. And you get these kind of coral diseases, which are imaginatively titled black band disease. There's a black band. We actually know relatively little about the biology of these diseases. They're just described by how they make the corals kind of appear. But they're bad for the corals. Okay, so at the end of a lecture, I will usually put up something like, this is the kind of stuff you might want to know. Not necessarily saying these are the exam questions, but the kind of things I expect students, the topics that they might want to go and read up some more about. Also, might link in the Learn site to, so Learn is that portal of online knowledge for each course. Might put some links to some feedback videos from previous exam questions where students can kind of like listen through and kind of look at the kind of answers that maybe they should be thinking about for these kind of topics. So that's the, I guess, the pre-honours kind of lecture example. That's the kind of stuff we would go through. It would be longer and there would be more stuff in it. But if we were looking at this at maybe a third or a fourth year particularly course, we might want to think about having not just a lecture, but we'd have a discussion session where we might think about what are some of the solutions to these problems. So this is kind of something that might appear in one of the option courses, Marine Systems Policy or Corals in a Changing Ocean, which are kind of like fourth or fifth year courses. We might say, well, you know, there are these things that are affecting corals. There's local problems. We might be adding too many nutrients or overfishing, or we might have global problems like ocean acidification or temperature rises. And then how do we go about, you know, doing something about these? Are there things that we can do locally or things that have to be acted on more globally? And what's effective? What do we need to put these things in place? That's more of a discussion rather than a, you know, lecture, exam type fiasco. Right, not fiasco, terribly good thing, right. Okay, so that's, yeah, that's it. So if you have some questions, then please ask them, then I can throw the asking microphone. Yeah, but I get to throw a thing. You speak into the box.
What is the email? What is the email address? You mentioned at the beginning of the lecture.
It's earth.sciences, I think, or earth.science. Is it earth.sciences or earth.science? I would look it up on the internet right now, but they've taken the internet away from me. Does anyone have one of the flyers from Earth Sciences? Who came to the stand?
Is it earth.sciences? Yeah.
Oh, here we go. Let's see if I can find you doing chemical engineering. Yeah, earth.sciences. .ed.act.uc. I could write that down if I had a. Ah. I've got some chalk, but no pen. I can't write it down. Oh, maybe a bit. Yeah, earth.sciences. Any other questions? If you have questions about some courses, I think the information stands are still open. There we go. There we go. Ta-da. Or you could go to the stand and pick up one of these and recycle responsibly. Anything else? Oh, get used to the microphone. Use the microphone. It's so much fun.
Okay, I just had a question about the lecture. So you said in the lagoons the pH varied a little bit more. Could that also be because like the temperature changes throughout the day are more significant in the lagoons, and then does that make enough of a difference to alter the pH throughout the day?
So you're absolutely correct. So the pH, the temperature will also change more throughout the day because there's actually a smaller body of water being heated up and cooled down. That will have a tiny direct effect on pH, but it will have more of an indirect effect on pH because the temperature will also have an effect on the rates of photosynthesis and the rates of calcification.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
There's a... Yeah.
How many of these types of lectures occur every week? How many of these lectures, these sorts of lectures?
So if you are, for the oceanography course, there are 3 lectures a week, and then there are three 3-hour practicals throughout the term. So of the science courses, it's probably about, I guess, average. Some courses will have slightly more, but probably more in terms of more practical classes and more field work. Yeah. That's a good question. Someone a long way away want to ask a question so we can really throw the thing. No? Okay. Well, you know what's going to be on the exam, so look it up. Okay? Thank you.